Welcome, everyone, to the third InSTEP session of the year. I'm Myron Brilliant, the Executive Vice President in charge of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. During our recent conversations with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield and then Admiral James Stavridis, we really discussed a range of topics from competition with China to America's role in today's very complex environment. We obviously talked about the Russia-Ukraine dynamics, and at the time, we were speculating about what Russia might do with its massive military buildup on Ukraine's border. Sadly, we don't have to speculate anymore. Only a few weeks after our last InSTEP session, we have now seen played out in real life and in a horrific fashion Russia's unjust, and I say unjust, invasion of Ukraine has brought war to Europe for the first time really since the 1940s. It's inflicting unfathomable destruction, despair, and death on Ukrainian citizens. Every night and every morning, we are devastated by the chilling images we see. Over one quarter of the 44 million people living in Ukraine have been displaced. There are 3.5 million refugees now and counting, leaving the country, many of them going to Poland. But we've seen the incredible resistance and resiliency of the Ukrainian people, fighting back with everything they've got. And we have stood with them in solidarity. We've seen the strong response from the United States and from Europe and others. It's really extraordinary, the unity among the United States, Europe, and the UK and other allies in responding quickly and firmly, making clear to Putin that his heinous acts and actions will inflict monumental damage on Russia's own economy and render the country a pariah state for many years to come. Developments in the past month surely will reverberate in ways that we can't even imagine. But one thing is for sure, the global order is changing. We thought it was particularly important to bring together our InSTEP community at this time. I know we've been doing a lot of programs with various government officials and, of course, with former government officials to talk about the implications of the crisis in Ukraine. And we probed a range of issues, drawing on the expertise of government officials and former government types. But today, we have two leading journalists who write about these topics on a daily basis. And of course, we were supposed to have David Sanger of the New York Times with us today, but he's on his way to Brussels to cover the president's trip this week, obviously, both in Brussels and in Poland. A reminder, this is on the record. Let me begin with brief introductions of the two journalists who are joining us here today. I'll start with Lingling Wei, the chief China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of Superpower Showdown. I recommend that book to everyone. Many of you joined a 2020 InSTEP program, Lingling and her co-author, Bob Davis, when the book first came out. Lingling has focused on her career on the intersection of business and politics and has won many awards for her China coverage, and these days is obviously looking at it from the perspective of how China is managing its relations with the West while also obviously engaging with Russia. She was based in the Wall Street Journal's Beijing bureau from 2011 until China expelled American reporters in the spring of 2020. She is now based in New York. Many of you may not be aware that her background includes the fact that her grandfather was an aide to Chairman Mao for 13 years. Fascinating background. Read her book and you'll see more about that. We're also very fortunate to be joined by David Ignatius. David is clearly a prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post who has had extensive coverage of the Middle East and the CIA for nearly 4 decades. David has written 11, let me remind everyone, 11 spy thrillers, many taking place on the line between fact and fiction. The most recent of these was from 2020, which was about a CIA officer who asked to infiltrate an American journalism operation overseas. You may remember David's great conversation with Ash Carter during an InSTEP event last spring, and David's been a regular on InSTEP as well as many other programs, and we thank both of them for their participation here today. David, I wanted to begin with you. You journeyed to Kiev in January of this year. Following your visit, you penned an opinion piece about arguing that Putin's invasion of Ukraine effectively ended the post-Cold War era. To set the table for today's discussion, why don't you enlighten us on what you were trying to convey in that piece and how developments since then maybe have reaffirmed some of the positions in that opinion piece? And thank you for joining the show today.
So thanks to Myron. It's really a pleasure to be with InSTEP again, and it's a special pleasure to share the virtual platform with Lingling Wei, whose coverage of China is authoritative and I've admired for many years. So I'm really glad to be here. I just returned last week from another trip to the region, traveling with General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'll bookend the two visits to Kiev right on the eve of the war and with General Milley about 2 weeks in to make some basic points. The structure of peace in Europe that's prevailed since the end of World War II has been shattered. We're seeing this horrific war take place. The efforts the United States made to deter it, to warn Russia against it, were strenuous, were, I think, well conceived, but were not successful. And we're now almost a month into this war with a level of destruction, human suffering in Ukraine that none of us could have imagined. Let me make a few tentative observations about a story that's dynamic, that is, I think, one of the, I want to say, the most dangerous period for the world in the time that I've been alive. I was born in 1950. I think this is a more dangerous moment even than the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of potential risks. But what do we conclude about this first month of war? First, there's no question that the Biden administration's effort to restore American alliances, especially the NATO alliance, but also alliances in Asia, has been crucial and effective. I think traveling with General Milley, it was possible to see along NATO's eastern flank in the Baltic countries, in Poland, in Romania, just how much force NATO has brought to bear quickly, the way in which the U.S. NATO command is integrated, interoperating with the forces of those NATO partners. It's quite striking, and I think has given Vladimir Putin pause about any thought of expanding the war. I think that said, the problem of deterrence of nuclear powers is more complicated now than it was before this war. Biden was not able to deter Putin from invading. Every day we wonder whether Putin will choose to jump domains, take this war into the cyber domain, to take it into the domain of chemical weapons, even to take it into the nuclear domain with use of tactical nuclear weapons initially, presumably, even as a demonstration. That would be norm shattering and could bring devastating consequences. I found, as I've tried to write about this conflict, that the X factor is morale. No one could have predicted the way in which Volodymyr Zelensky would, by his personal example, by his physical courage, rally not just Europe, but the whole world. He's made the Ukrainian cause seem immediate and visceral, and I think that is a factor of great significance. I think it sets up a real dilemma because Biden's policy is premised on containing this war within Ukraine. So the U.S. and other allies are watching this horrible destruction, but have limited themselves to saying they won't intervene directly militarily. I think wisely because of the dangers, but it's excruciating to watch this country we've grown to love suffer so badly. Make a final point, which is that this war has demonstrated the power of American intelligence, both our ability to collect information, the most secret information, orders to military units in the field, orders for plans of covert action, false flag plots. It's obvious the U.S. has gathered that information through sources and methods, and then made the extraordinary decision to push it out to the public. And that's obviously had a real disruptive effect on Russia, which is used to controlling the information space, but in this case has not. I think adversaries around the world must wonder if the Americans can read seemingly every bit of Putin's mail, what else can they do in this electronic domain? So I think that's been like some other developments in this war, a reinforcement of the continuing power of the United States, its ability to coordinate economic sanctions, coordinate the military response of its partners. So we watch and wait. I want to say pray, because this is such a dangerous situation that there'll be some resolution short of the absolute physical destruction of Ukraine. But what a terrible situation for the world to be in. I'll leave it at that, Myron.
Well, David, let me. We're going to get into what this means for NATO and red lines in a little bit. But before I get there, let me ask you about what I see as the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good here is that America's intelligence really came to the forefront. There's some other good as well, which is the United States and Europe working closer together. Is this something that can be sustained now going forward? This war could be prolonged indefinitely. We don't know the outcome. We don't know what's going to be the exit ramp for this war. Obviously, Turkey and Israel are going to try to play a role here in mediating peace, but that prospect is still probably out of ways. And so, as the economic sanctions hit not only Russia, and they've hit them hard, but they hit the rest of the world, do you see any chance of Europe being a little weaker down the road, or do you think we have seen I hate to use the word Sputnik moment, but a moment in time where NATO, the West, is going to be more united than ever before, and that Russia has projected this out for the future? Do we see this trend in that direction?
So, as we try to look forward, there's every prospect that Europe will have a festering, sometimes hot military conflict at its eastern edge indefinitely. Even in the peace negotiations that have been taking place between Russia and Ukraine, I am told by my Ukrainian sources the Russians have not offered a troop withdrawal as part of the agreement. They've offered discussed a ceasefire, but not the withdrawal of troops. So they could remain there as a kind of poison for Europe for a long time. That said, if the West, in quotation marks, were a stock that you could buy on an exchange, I'd say it's a screaming buy after what's happened. I think a Western alliance that 2 years ago was just limping, demoralized, attacked by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who seemed to want to pull American troops not just out of NATO, but out of many countries around the world. Our alliances, I think the center of American power in the world, seem to be in decay. Today, they're as strong as I think most of us have seen them in decades, and I think that's going to continue. I think the collective West, just take Vladimir Putin's word for it. Reading his recent comments, he sees the collective West organized to defeat his goals. And I think it'd be fascinating to hear what Lingling says, but my sense is that China, watching Putin back himself into a corner, doesn't want to be too close to that cornered Russian leader. Understands that Europe is really embracing the United States, moving together with the United States, and that China needs to be careful about not alienating a more unified European American group. So in that sense, I think there are going to be some positive long-term outcomes, even granting the horror of what Putin is doing.
Lingling, let me turn to you. Obviously, the conflict touches China from many different angles. It's clear that the friendship that has no limits probably does have some limits. And I'd be interested, one, how does China manage this tightrope? On the one hand, they probably welcome the diversion away from U.S.-China tensions. On the other hand, they respect territorial sovereignty. They talk about that a lot. They have billions of dollars invested in Ukraine. They're part of the One Belt, One Road strategy, but they have an economic relationship, particularly around gas, that's important. And we have seen sort of a blue, red, and gray team emerge in this conflict. And I wonder, with all the coverage you've done, how you see the current state of affairs, how Chinese leadership is looking at the pictures that show up every day of people dying in Ukraine, and whether they're recalibrating their perspective on how close they should be to Russia in light of the growing pressures coming from the West. Lingling, your thoughts?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you, Myron and David. One of the most authoritative voices on world affairs. So absolutely, China is in a very difficult position right now. As you pointed out, Myron, they're really trying to square their support for Russia with their longstanding foreign policy principles around no interference and the respect for sovereignty, which Russia's invasion of Ukraine clearly violates. And they also, the Chinese are also trying very hard to avoid rupturing the relationships with US and Europe, which are both very important markets for China, much more important than Russia's market. So I think, this is definitely a very hard balancing act for the Chinese. I do think their strategy is increasingly clearer now. They're definitely not backing down from their partnership with Putin and with Russia. That's because of President Xi Jinping's own strategic focus on having a big country, a big power like Russia, to act to work together as a counterweight against the U.S.-led global order. So that strategic focus is not changing. On the other hand, they're also trying to show support and sympathy for the Ukrainians. You ask about, what are going through their mind when they see all the casualties, the children, the women, getting hurt by this awful war. I think the Chinese leadership has been pretty unsettled by, the scale of this conflict. So they're definitely trying to do this diplomatic dance here. But I think how successful they are in terms of, avoiding rupturing relationships with the West, at the same time maintaining partnership with Russia, really depends on how much China ultimately does to support Putin and Russia. Based on our conversations with Chinese officials, it's clear that they are going to maintain the kind of what they call normal economic ties with Russia, meaning they continue to buy oil and gas from Russia. As you know, that they signed a huge deal 3 weeks before Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they do not think that would violate the U.S. sanctions and Western sanctions on Russia, because other countries in Europe and in Asia still also doing that kind of trade with Russians. But we were told that the Chinese will close security support for Russia, meaning the kind of arm transfers highlighted and worried by people in the United States and Europe very likely not happen. because once you have made in China bullets on the streets of Ukraine, the Chinese side would lose any kind of deniability. So they're going to be super careful with how much they can do help the Russians. Yesterday I just had a conversation with a friend who works at a very big state bank in China. They were telling us that the Russian banks have reached out to them trying to sell assets to them at very low prices. And the Chinese response was, no, we're not touching that, because they're really, really scared that they would be caught in collateral damage as a result of Western sanctions on Russia. So I think ultimately how they do with this juggling act, it really lies with how much support they end up giving Russia.
Lingling, you're right about the secondary sanctions, and I think that's an issue I'm sure the Chinese leadership thinks about. But there were tensions in the U.S.-China relationship well before this recent invasion. Those tensions still exist on the economic front. Europe, however, was a different story in some respects, particularly the Germany-Chinese relationship. Europe has shared some of the interests of the United States, but hasn't been necessarily at the forefront of some of the conflict between the United States and China. That may change now in light of the dynamics around Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Certainly, the summit coming up between Xi and the European leaders suggests that Xi is very aware that he can't lose the West and he can't lose Europe. How do you see that summit shaping up? What objectives would Xi have for that summit? And in light of the fact that obviously our president is in Brussels today with European leaders, what is Xi and the leadership thinking about their role with particularly Europe?
Sure. So David also mentioned earlier about this, amazing alliance taking shape between U.S. and its allies in Europe. I think that's definitely something worries China's leadership very much. In terms of the U.S.-China relationship, the Chinese would like to say, we have already abandoned any kind of illusion that U.S.-China ties will be getting better in any way. But for Europe, they really think Europe is even more important than ever. And, they cannot afford to lose Europe at a time when they already lost America. So for this upcoming EU-China summit, I think based on our reporting, the Chinese leaders will really try to talk up the space for EU-China cooperation going forward, and will present China as a neutral party to the conflict, i.e. they do not oppose Russia. They understand Russians' security concerns. They also will provide humanitarian support to Ukraine. And they're also going to support the idea of having Europe playing a leading role in negotiations. So that's basically, what we understand, the key message from the Chinese leadership to European leaders. Obviously, as President Biden is in Brussels this week and trying to, coordinate united message on China with European leaders, it would be really interesting to see, how the European leaders frame its message to China. Would be a straightforward warning to China, or a more subtle message. So that would be really interesting to see.
Well, I'm guessing that President Biden gave a pretty direct message to President Xi when it comes to the military piece. David, I want to turn it back to you. You referenced your article in which you talked about seeing Putin at a Munich security conference really denounce NATO. And honestly, when I was in the Middle East this past week, I heard from people in Israel and Turkey that, the United States and the West expanded NATO and provoked Russia. Now, that's one interpretation. It certainly isn't a reason for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it gives some context to how some people around the world might view NATO's expansion. Now I have We have Finland and Sweden looking to expand into NATO. Obviously, Germany has increased its defense budget significantly, a huge game changer in many ways. But we haven't yet seen the United States and Europe impose what we call a red line. We saw the United States impose a red line and not actually utilize it in the context of Syria. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, with all the atrocities building up, there doesn't seem to be a red line for NATO's engagement on the ground. But the use of tactical nuclear weapons, biological or chemical, certainly one of the outcomes in Brussels is going to be a strong statement from Europe and the United States aligned around the use of these kinds of chemicals and biological and potentially nuclear weapons. Is that the red line that's going to come out of the NATO summit this week? Is there other things that could trigger an expansion of conflict in the region, which would be very dangerous? What do you see as potential red lines for U.S. and NATO engagement in the Ukrainian space?
So one obvious red line, repeated often by President Biden and his aides, is that not 1 inch of NATO territory can be attacked. And they've repeated it, reinforced it with military deployments. I think one lesson from the Syria red line experience is that the United States, other countries have to be careful about publicly stating red lines in circumstances where their actions might be complicated for all sorts of reasons. So it's my guess that the United States has been communicating its determination to respond to any use of chemical weapons or practical nuclear weapons privately, not publicly. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think private communication often in delicate diplomatic situations produces better results than public communications. I think as we think broadly about this war, one haunting question is how the world will be put back together eventually when the security system that prevailed has been seen to fail. What's the reconstruction post-Ukraine that we can envision that in some way would be worthy of the reconstruction that followed the end of World War II? And as I begin thinking about this, talking with thoughtful people, I think as in 1945, new structures, new understandings need to be premised on security for all parties, including Russia and China. I don't buy the idea that the expansion of NATO triggered Putin's invasion, but it is true that for 15 years, Putin has been saying, first in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, but repeatedly thereafter, that he was determined to address this question of Ukraine. He went to war in 2014 to seize Crimea and the Donbass. He keeps coming back and banging on that drum. And one lesson of this is not taking that seriously, not resolving that conflict short of outright full-scale war whose devastating consequences we're watching was a mistake. In some way, it was necessary to address that and to make Minsk agreements work, to make the necessary compromises. So that's a lesson for me. And going forward, similarly, Russia is going to come out of this war badly battered. Its performance, military performance on the ground, we can already see is just a real demonstration of the continuing weakness of Russian militarily. I've said that this could end up being the second fall of the Soviet Union in effect. So we're going to have a battered, unsuccessful Russia that's going to be like the nations that have suffered failure in war, feeling very defensive. And I think in some way, not to Putin, but to Russia as a country, Russians as a people, there does need to be an effort to assure them that there's a future in Europe, in the world, in which Russia is respected, and so long as it plays by the rules of the order. So that'd be my hope. It's a roundabout way of answering your question about NATO expansion. I think we see the value of being a member of NATO. Just travel as I did to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and it's a good thing to be in NATO. But in the future, we can't just ignore Russia's arguments that its security matters too. It does.
Well, David, look, in the United States, I think public opinion is pretty united right now behind the administration's approach. Similarly, in Europe now, for the first time, most Europeans see Russia as a direct threat. That's going to be hard to change overnight. And of course, if there is an enlargement of the conflict involving NATO troops or no-fly zones, which is not being contemplated at this time, that's going to put the public opinion at risk as well if this war would drag on and there's an expansion. Notwithstanding that, your broader point about the international system begs the question of what does that international system look like? Is it building from within the existing frameworks, or is it going to be a continuation of all these sort of one-off forums, right? We have our own Quad with the Japanese and with of course, the Indians and the Australians, and we are developing other similar kinds of mechanisms. We see one now with Israel, right, and other countries. And similarly, China and Russia have had their own various formulations. Is that the world we're going to talk about, where everyone breaks down into these little silo groups? Or are we going to reconstitute and re-strengthen the existing international system as we built in the Bretton Woods period and forward? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think that's the great challenge. Putin's behavior is so egregious that I think people in their gut would like to see unconditional surrender by Russia. Putin's total defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan allowed the reconstruction of those countries as democracies, as dynamic market economies. It really enabled the extraordinary progress of the world in the second half of the 20th century. So on one level, we'd love to see the unconditional defeat and surrender of Putin's regime. But a country that has nuclear weapons, that's really not an option. It's one thing that we're being reminded of. So some security system, obviously based on the existing institutions, but addressing security concerns broadly, that's what happens after wars. If visionary statesmen, stateswomen look carefully, they build a structure that ends up making all parties feel more secure. It's early with this war raging to talk in detail about this, but I hope thoughtful people at the State Department and at other foreign ministries are doing that. Again, the change that I've seen in these last weeks in Europe is stunning. The change in Germany, it's a level of commitment to the alliance, to the use of German military power to secure the alliance and its interests. Traveling, as I did with General Milley, you drive down any main boulevard in Poland, in Lithuania, Estonia, you name the country, and you see Ukrainian flags flying, not from every building, but from a lot of them. There's this intense, passionate sense of engagement from Europeans in the basic values of this democratic alliance. So what a strong building block that will be if people use it wisely.
Lingling, I know that China pays attention when the United States holds a summit on democracy. And this theme of democracy versus autocracy has been an issue that China pays attention to. Is the United States and others trying to dive a wedge between autocratic governments and democratic governments? And that's a big challenge in restoring the kind of unity that David hopes comes out of the conflict in Europe. In addition, certainly China is paying a lot of attention to the situation there because of its own desires or potential desires around Taiwan. And I wanted to get from you a sense, is It's still an evolving conflict, but do you think that the Chinese leadership is thinking differently today about Taiwan, in part a response to what's happened in Ukraine, the strong resistance, the strong rebuttal from the West, the swift reaction on economic sanctions? Will this have any impact in the calculus of thinking with respect to Taiwan? Obviously, this is a year about stability in China. We'll get into that. But what's your thinking in terms of how the leadership might see the consequences of actions in the cross straits as a result of the conflict in Ukraine?
Sure. That's a very important question because China definitely is watching, how the Ukraine crisis unfold and Western reaction to Russia invasion very, very, very closely. And even though it's not necessarily this Russian invasion of Ukraine, not necessarily change the timetable the leadership might have for making a move on Taiwan. They're really watching it in term, for both military, economic, and geopolitical, diplomatic aspects of this whole incident. So there's really the degree of sanctions and the kind of unity between U.S. and Europe in terms of the resolve to sanction Russia is not something the Chinese had expected, because in a lot of Chinese officials' views, U.S. and Europe, those capitalist countries, they don't have many values. Capitalism is really in pursuit of profits. So the kind of shared value that presented in this kind of unity is something that really took surprised the Chinese side. So that's definitely something they would reconsider how what kind of sanctions China might encounter in the event that they do decide to move on Taiwan. And I would like to see also to add one point to this is that even before Russian invasion of Ukraine took place, China there was debate within the Chinese leadership in terms of what to do with Taiwan. Even before what we're today, there wasn't a consensus in terms of exactly what kind of Taiwan strategy China should adopt. Despite all those rhetorics in China in the past few months about taking Taiwan back, it should be really easy. In reality, that would be far more difficult than it was made out to be. I just remember, when we were having some conversations with Chinese officials about this issue, and one historical anecdote they would, frequently bring up was back in the 1949. There was a very decorated PLA general called Xiao Feng. He directed the whole battle of Kinmen back then. And he was deeply trusted by Mao, but he failed at that battle, and his strategy cost the lives of 9,000 Chinese soldiers. So the kind of rough seas and distance from the mainland, where Taiwan is, it's basically just, a very, very difficult endeavor for the Chinese military, despite the buildup in recent years. So and when some in the official circles would still think back on that battle, and that would still make them cringe. Years later, when my dad was assigned to work for that general, and he was so disappointed because he got to work for a general that's known as someone who lost the Battle of Kinmen. So despite the very tough talks by people like some nationalistic commentators in China, the Chinese leadership really hasn't reached a consensus in terms of what to do with Taiwan. So that's basically status quo right now. But they are watching this Ukraine crisis very, very closely in terms of how the West would respond if that day comes for China.
Well, I'm going to come back to you in a second on Xi's domestic standing in light of what's happening this year and conflict in Europe, whether it's impacted. But David, I want to turn to you a little bit about the Middle East. And obviously, we don't talk enough about the fact that we're on the verge of a deal to get Iran back into the new amended JCPOA. And in fact, that deal would have been announced next week, but for the Russia dynamic and the Russian views on that deal, even though they had been proponents of it. So one, I want to get your sense of the impact of that on some of the geopolitical tensions and how does that address it? Second, I would argue the Trump administration's one of their greatest feats was the fact that they were supportive of the Abraham Accords. Now we have a region where the UAE and Saudi Arabia have basically rejected U.S. pleas to increase export of oil. And we see Egypt just signed a big deal with Russia. So a little sense of the context of what's going on in the Middle East, both in reaction to the conflict, but also, frankly, reaction to U.S. pleas. The fact that we don't seem to get the Arabs moving aligned with us as much as we've seen the reaction in Europe in a positive way, I'd say we've seen some resistance. And tell us how you think that's playing out in U.S. thinking and also, obviously, in the Arab world from your perspective.
Well, as strong as the U.S. Partnerships in Europe are, and I'd say that partnerships in Asia similarly seem very strong with Japan, Australia, certainly India increasingly. As strong as those are, U.S. traditional partnerships in the Middle East are really in retreat. There's just no other way to see Saudi Arabia's refusal to help the U.S. by pumping more oil, keeping global energy prices down, other than just a rejection of U.S. leadership. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is angry at President Biden. The UAE is hedging its bets, increasingly involved with China, Russia, even Iran, although I think that they're nervous about Iran. Myron, in talking about the Iranian nuclear deal, I don't have any current news beyond what you said, that the deal is very close, that it's on hold because of the Ukrainian war. Not a lot to add to that, but I do want to make a couple of points that are related. I've offered some pretty positive comments about aspects of this war, but I want to add two quite negative ones. First, this war in Ukraine has been a demonstration of the usefulness of having nuclear weapons. The reason that we don't have a no-fly zone over Ukraine that could stop the slaughter of Ukrainians is because Russia has nuclear weapons. If Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons after 1994, when it gave them up under U.S. pressure, would Russia have invaded Ukraine? I doubt it. So if you're Iran, if you're Saudi Arabia, go down the list of countries that are thinking about nuclear weapons. The value of them is just lit up in neon by this war. And I think this war will end up being the biggest boon, I'm sorry to say, to nuclear proliferation in modern history. That's dangerous. A second point that relates to Iran, but more generally to the world. One of the great successes the United States has had in this war is getting the unity of its European allies and also key allies in Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, other countries, in joining in the economic sanctions against Russia, which are unusually strong. It remains to be seen whether they're being fully implemented, but to get the world's central banks essentially to blacklist the Russian central bank is extraordinary. One outcome of that, we should remind ourselves, is that China will say to itself, we don't ever want to be in this situation ourselves in a confrontation. So I would think that the moves that were already afoot to move away from dollarization of global finance, to move away from reliance exclusively on US-led money centers is going to accelerate, because China in particular, but other countries too, seeing the power of economic sanctions, won't want to be caught down the road by their reliance on assets the United States and its allies control. So I just, those are two, I think, quite negative aspects of the conflict that we haven't talked about, and I wanted to mention.
Well, David, your first point is quite chilling, and you didn't even use the word North Korea in your sentence, but the North Korea is another part of that equation, but it's chilling. And your second point, I could not agree more, although for the time being, both Russia and China are dependent on trade in dollars and euros, and very much so. And so, yes, there may be more emphasis. You know that China's leadership has always wanted to move to RMB being an internationally recognized currency, but they haven't gotten there yet. And depending on their actions, it actually might counter their ambition in that regard. We'll have to see how this plays out. But you're right; they're going to be watching how these economic sanctions are taking a bite out of Russia's $630 billion of currency reserves and quickly crippling that economy. China's economy is at a different scale. It's much more globally integrated, but still, we'll have to see how that plays out. David, I want to come back to you on another country, and before I turn back to Lingling, and that's India. India has always sought some strategic autonomy. Since President Bush, there's been a concerted effort to strengthen the alliance between the United States and India. Obviously, the civilian nuclear deal was part of that. Yet, there's also been an allowance to let India continue to have strong defense sales with Russia, partly as a counterbalance to China. Now we see an effort to bring India into the fold through the Quad and through the Indo-Pacific strategy. But India is difficult to bring in as a full aligned partner like the West. Certainly, Prime Minister Modi wants to move around his dance card, so to speak. How do you see the relationship of India evolving, India's own place in this conflict, both hedging its bets, but also signaling to the West that they do want to have a long-term strategic relationship? How do you see this playing out?
So I'd say it's a corollary benefit for the United States that two of the countries that are U.S. Partners that also had pretty close relations with Russia sought to improve those relations, specifically India and Japan. I think are going to need to distance themselves as Russia is now an international pariah. And that status will continue, I think, as long as Vladimir Putin remains the Russian leader. So there's going to be more distance in the India-Russia and the Japan-Russia relationship than there would have been otherwise. And that's beneficial for the U.S. One thing that I learned about India is that expecting India to be a overt ally beyond its economic, technology, self-interest is a mistake. So I would expect that the moves toward greater cooperation, which I think are going to continue. Indians are genuinely worried about Chinese danger along their borders. I think that cooperation will happen more out of sight than in sight. It won't be a formal, explicit NATO-like partnership, but I think it's going to deepen. That'd be my guess, and I think that's important as we think about the future of the Indo-Pacific
And the future of alliances around the world. Lingling, let me go back to you. Obviously, we've got the 20th National Congress this fall in Beijing. Xi Jinping is going to seek a third term. One expects he will do it. There'll be a shuffling within the Bureau, the 25 body of the Communist Party, but the leadership at the top will probably not change. But how's his domestic standing today in China? The economy's been weak. Obviously, the conflict is being seen by Chinese citizens. What's Xi's standing going into the fall party Congress, and how much has he been impacted by current events in Europe?
Sure. So this year, Xi Jinping craves nothing more than stability. But stability is one thing he's not having these days. Economically, China is, China's economy really is losing momentum pretty sharply, largely as a result of the government's own doing, especially over the past year. This whole campaign, driven by Xi's political and ideological agenda, has really sapped a lot of energy out of the private sector. And the latest current event you mentioned, the war in Ukraine, again is adding to the economic uncertainty in China these days. You see the stock markets in China, kept plunging in the past few weeks, and that caused the top leadership have to come out and try to assure investors of their policy. So it's not in a great position right now, but also because there is no other obvious candidate for him. So the likelihood of Xi Jinping, succeeds at breaking with this established succession system and securing another term, it's very, very high. But as we just laid out, what has happened definitely has shown the limits of his power. That could potentially make it harder for him to carry out the visions he has had for China. For example, the return to the Maoist socialist vision. As we see nowadays, his political slogan, "Common Prosperity," is barely mentioned anymore because the kind of impact it has had on private businesses and others. So he's still is secure in his hold on power. However, it's not as secure as maybe just a few months ago, and there are definitely different voices, different debates going on within the top leadership. There are two major criticisms that officials within the party have had about Xi. The first one is about the economy. They felt like over the past 10 years, he spent too much time focusing on politics, but not as much on developing China's economy. The second major criticism is, how the U.S.-China relationship has, deteriorated to such a low level, under his leadership, because we have to remember that the U.S.-China relationship is something generations of Chinese leaders spent, many years, building up. It started with actually Mao Zedong himself, Nixon visit to China in 1972. So, it's not very, not as smooth sailing for Xi as he probably had wanted to. But despite all the challenges and all the different voices and the views, he's very likely still going to be there. But I think his limits of power, the limits of his power, are definitely showing as well.
Lingling, and then David, I'm going to ask you about the U.S.-China alliance as well. But Lingling, let me just ask you to elaborate a little bit more. So there are clearly been strains. We've talked about this before, you and I, and obviously the extent of these strains are on the political, the security, and the economic front, the three pillars of the relationship. And I would argue the human rights piece. how much will this current period require a rethink in Beijing in terms of its relationship with the United States in particular? Are there voices inside the country that are encouraging Xi to take a different tack? Right now, I see the Chinese leadership hands off with the United States in this particular sensitive period, meaning not really engaging on the economic tracks, not fulfilling their obligations on phase one, not agreeing to move forward on structural reforms, not having the kind of dialogues that one would expect between the two superpowers. Is there any chance that this might change after the Party Congress, that Chinese leadership would try to rethink its strategy with the United States? Or are they going to continue to wait this out to see what happens politically in Washington? What's your take?
I think one big factor is how China's economy doing going forward. If there's enough pressure on the economy, some kind of revolt, especially among China's middle class, the leadership may have to find itself having to change tack. And as we said earlier, there's definitely debate going on within China's policymakers. The bear huggers, the bear critics, involving how close China should be to Russia. However, and we also wrote about this, China's foreign policy is dominated by Xi Jinping himself. And he has made security concerns front and center in China's foreign policy. And to him, the United States represents the biggest security problem for China. So for the time being, especially when he's in the run up to the Party Congress, it's very unlikely China will change its foreign policy focus and change it back to be more pro the U.S. But going forward, many factors at play here. Who is going to be the next president? What kind of China policy U.S. will adopt, and also probably more important than anything else is how China's economy is going to do going forward now that it's becoming increasingly closed and isolated from the West.
David, I know we're running up against the clock, so let me just ask you for your reflections. In some ways, the Biden administration has carried on much of the muscular approach that President Trump's administration took towards China. No one wants to cede ground. This is one issue that unites Democrats and Republicans generally. Do you think there's an opportunity, particularly with Europe, to build a more strategic, coherent strategy towards China? We haven't really seen that articulated. There was an intention to do that. It's been delayed because of, obviously, the environment in Europe. But there are challenges with Europe. We have headwinds with them on technology issues and other issues. So what's your take on how we go forward now? Because the biggest long-term challenge facing the United States, other than issues like climate, is the U.S.-China relationship from a foreign policy standpoint.
So I do hear, Myron, from Europeans' desire to be part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Certainly the French truly felt left out in AUKUS and have been pleased that they're being drawn into strategic discussions as the U.S. thinks about the future. I just close with one brief thought, which is that this war in Ukraine has reminded us all of the danger of world war and the use of nuclear weapons. Here we have people buying iodine around the world in fear of nuclear attacks. So one thing that I hope the Chinese leadership will consider is beginning a serious dialogue with the United States, much as Russia did during the days of the Soviet Union, about nuclear arms control. China has been in a nuclear weapons modernization program that's been accelerating and has been completely outside the framework of discussion that the U.S. and Russia evolved, U.S. and Soviet Union evolved. And I hope China, seeing the dangers that these weapons pose, seeing the need for a language to discuss strategic stability, will consider in the aftermath of the Ukrainian war some adjustment of their policies so that that kind of dialogue can begin. It's really important, and I'll just leave it at that.
David and Lingling, this has been a sobering interview. These are not light topics, and they could take hours, but I want to end with one lighter question for both of you. The Oscars are 4 days away. Lingling, you studied English basically through watching, Growing Pains and American movies. And David, you should be proud that one of your books from 2007 is going to turn into a movie. And no question, everyone needs to watch a movie that has Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe in it. So I'm a big advocate of what David has done to get that movie across the board. So Lingling, first you, just briefly, just give us a sense of how movies influence your impressions of the West. And David, tell us what we should be taking from that movie and your experience in working with these actors to make them understand why this spy novel was so important. You first, Lingling.
First of all, congratulations to David. That's wonderful. Russell Crowe is one of my
Body of Lies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, how American movies influenced my thinking on America. I think the biggest influence is that it's okay to talk back to your parents.
Well, that's important lesson learned. And David, just what you take from your great experience seeing one of your books. I was going to reference my friend Michael Punk here and his experience. What's your experience been like?
In the moments we have left, I'll just say that if you have 3 daughters, as I do, having Leonardo DiCaprio visit the house to talk about the character that he's going to play in the movie that you helped write is a good thing. I'm not sure my daughters have ever forgiven me for not summoning them back home when DiCaprio arrived at the door, but they did get to meet him later and at the premiere. And I'm a movie nut, and one of the things that I've loved over many years is quality Chinese films, especially historical films. And I'd love to see more global cinema, more Chinese and Indian films competing at the box office when we're all back in theaters.
Well, first off, thank you for that reaction. I was going to ask you both to pick the winner, but in the time we have left, let me just thank David and Lingling for a sobering but thorough review of current affairs. Obviously, our hearts go out to the people in Ukraine. We are very much in touch with the Ukrainian government and with many others in providing humanitarian support. The business community of the United States has spoken with a strong, unified voice. But these are difficult times, and this country faces difficult challenges going forward, not just in our relations with Russia and China, but how we pick up the pieces from here, as David outlined. How do we rebuild the fragile system that we see in the international order? And of course, how do we do that in a unified way? There's a lot of roads ahead, but I am so grateful for the leadership of our country at this time coming together. I'm very grateful for David and Lingling's important contribution as journalists. And with that, I thank you all for tuning in today. All the best with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you.